This video has been made possible by ENAR, the European Network Against Racism.
This shadow report is focusing on people of African descent and Black Europeans, and we're launching it today. It's a compilation of information, statistics, data on racism facing people of African descent. And to discuss some of the findings and some of the issues, we will be talking to our participants around the table. We have Jallo Mamadou, who's the ENAR Vice Chair and Pan-African Movement for Justice Sweden. We have Mireille Fanon-Mendes France, who's Chair of the UN Working Group on People of African Descent. Thank you. We have Jessica Diabru and Mitchell Essayas from the New Urban Collective in the Netherlands. Welcome. I'm Ojiaku Wabuze, ENAR's Senior Research Officer, and I have been working on ENAR's shadow report on Afrophobia in Europe. And we are just going to ask them a few questions so that they can share their perspectives from their working groups and their countries. The first question that I have for you is, what's the single largest challenge Black people face in Europe from your perspective?
Okay, so I can speak from a Dutch perspective. I think it's hard to choose one challenge because they are all actually really interconnected. For example, it starts with, with education. You have a lot of structural barriers, which leads to structural barriers in the labor market, which has a huge effect on the socio-economic position of people of African descent in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And also when it comes to political representation, which is a lack, and also political power, it turns into a huge problem for us.
Regarding what Mrs. said, I think also the Afro-descent people in Europe are faced to know and to understand first they are faced with structural racism institutionalized in each institution in Europe. And now we are in Brussels and we could see how it is institutional even at the European level. And also they have to know how to deconstruct the origin of this structural racism. I mean, how to go back to the history of trade slave and enslavement and to denounce this belief of hierarchy of race and hierarchy of culture. If we affirm we are only one humanity, and if the UN Charter is based on non-discrimination and equality, it means this non-discrimination and equality is for everybody, every country, every state, but also and specifically every person of each population. And this is absolutely not the case now.
It's quite difficult to choose one challenge that you would say is the fundamental challenge that Black people are facing today. I would like to divide it into three aspects. The first one is the production of knowledge that is used to dehumanize Black people and have been used throughout history to humanize Black people, denigrate them. So for Black people to be able to change that, we have to decolonize knowledge. And in all forms of knowledge that is produced in media, that is produced in literature, that we are taught in universities, that we teach our children in school, in kindergarten, primary school, that has to change. That's one of the main fundamental challenges that I think we face. The second production is the production of material. That means that the people that own the means of production, the people that would hire you if you apply for a job, the people that own the wealth and accumulated wealth that has been accumulated throughout history, in the backs of black people through colonization and slave trade. That has to change, which means that for that to happen, there has to be some form of redistribution of wealth and power, distribution of the ownership of the method of production. And then the third one, which is also extremely important, which is the production of policies, which is the state that plays that role. Governments. Black people do not have access to governments. If you look at our representation when it comes to political representation, it is second to none. I mean, it doesn't exist at all. And this is true in every European country that you go to. It is not because of black people have just arrived here, because black people have been in existence in Europe, forever. We contributed in the production of what is known as the European civilization today. But the few people, we look at France, look at Italy, it's quite recently that you have people in government, that would have minister positions that are black, and even those people that are on those positions are victimized, they're denigrated, they're humanized, they're dehumanized at a level that you don't see any other group suffering from. So I think these three aspects of production in society, I think, together makes up the power structure that racism is about.
Thanks, Jallo, for those points that you raised, all of which are in the Shadow Report, which you also contributed to. But I would also like to ask you a question on the title of the report, which is Afrophobia in Europe. Could you firstly tell us what Afrophobia is, and why is it important that we use this term?
Quite often when we use language of the oppressor to describe our realities. And it's about time, when we talk about decolonization, language plays a very important role. It's about time that black people also construct their own language, their own terms that they use that define our own reality with our own terms. And the term Afrophobia is a term that we constructed ourselves. And when we say Afro, quite often people say, you mean the hair. That's not what it means. That's the white man's dictionary that's saying Afro is the hair. Now, black people, for us, when we describe the word Afro, we try to refer to every person of African descent. That's our own definition of the term. And then phobia, people would say, it's a fear, it's a somehow medical condition. When we talk about phobia, we try to make the analysis which goes into very deeply into what racism means. And racism, you cannot talk about it without talking about power relations. Racism is about power and privileges. Now, people in power, they define the conditions of living of those that don't have power. And black people have always been at the bottom end of this hierarchy. Now, what we're saying is that people in power never give up their power voluntarily. They would fight to keep their power positions. Now, black people, what we're saying is that we want to get some of that power. We need some kind of a distribution of power and wealth and privileges so that we can have our fair share of that. Now, because the people in power will never give up their power, when we try to get that power, that creates a fear. And the fear of losing power to black people, that's what Afrophobia is.
Thanks, Jallo. Okay, Mitchell, do you want to add anything?
It's very clear when you read the report, is that Afrophobia is a very distinctive form of racism, which affects people of African descent, not only in Europe, but across the world. And the reason that it's so imperative to make a distinction between different forms of oppression, different forms of racism, is not only because it affects us in our current daily lives in different ways, but also because it's rooted in a specific history, a history of colonialism, a history of slavery, a history that started in this place, in Europe, in European nations, who colonized different parts of the world, who transported people of African descent and brought them to the Americas and different parts of the world to gain wealth, to gain power. As Jallo just said, Afrophobia is about power and privilege, and the power that certain groups of people have in the current society has been built up on the dehumanization and oppression of people of African descent in the past centuries. So when we talk about decolonization and the fight against Afrophobia and racism, I think it's imperative to take this history into account. And it doesn't mean that it's not related to other forms of racism, such as Islamophobia, such as anti-Semitism, even sexism, and homophobia are interrelated. But I think that if we really want to root this societal problem out, it's necessary to have a very clear understanding of the thing that we want to, fight against, and to develop solutions in these different areas of society.
And Mireille, I know that you're the chair of the UN Working Group. How is that term used at the UN?
One thing, it was very difficult to work on racism, of this so specific racism affecting Afro-descent people and even Africans everywhere in the world, because it was not defined. And the fact to not define one kind of racism is to make invisible the people who are victims of. And that's why it's so important to get a definition. This definition as a working group came from the ground, from the grassroots organization. And we totally assume to use it now in our presentation and text. And even we try to include it in the lexical field of the UN. It's not very easy, but I'm sure we will get the point very soon. I have to mention, I was surprised. I was in New York for a meeting at the UN New York, and the High Commissioner sent a message. And in his message, he used the term Afrophobia. That means now it is in the mind of the UN representative and functionary to implement, to use these terms, who for the first time qualify exactly the kind of racism which affect people of African descent.
It's really great that you're enthusiastic about the use of the term Afrophobia, but we know that there are critics, there are people who don't agree with using that term. And what would you say to those people who don't agree with using that term?
I would like to say, for the other kind of racism, there is definition. Anti-Semitism, anti-Roma, anti-Islam or Islamophobia, anti-gay, homophobia, and so. But it's strange. The first victim who inaugurates this so particular racism has never get a clear definition of the victim, of the racism they are victim. It's very strange. And when you ask that to the people, they say we don't need that. And it was one of the points at Durban, during the Durban conference in 2001. And there is like, in the mind of the people, of the dominant people, there is something like a competition. If we succeed to get something, we will be more visible. And therefore, the dominant need to take in account our Afro-descent and African people. And it is like a competition in regards with other races. And that's why it was so important to use this term and to get this term from the grassroots.
Why has Europe failed to address the situation faced by Black people?
In the Netherlands, I think the case of people of African descent is a perfect case to test democracy. Are their voices heard? Do they have a political voice? Are their rights protected? Is there equality? Is there equal opportunities? And the answer would be, I guess, no. And if the answer is no, is democracy in Europe living to its full potential? So I think it's also a good start to repair that democracy process.
Thank you, Jessie. Jallo, I think you mentioned earlier black people's involvement in politics and public life. Do you want to make a comment on this as well?
Just like the previous speaker said, it's a democratic question. In Europe, there's a democratic deficit, even though we portray ourselves as the most democratic and civilized societies in the world. But the problem is that we call ourselves first-class democracies, and then we have second-class citizens. And black people, they are in the category of being second-class citizens. And this is nothing new. This is something that has been in existence historically. When you have a society in which black people cannot move safely in the society, in public space, without fearing for their lives, where you have police brutality, black people being burned down, dead in a cell, and when you take them to court, the court would throw the complaint out, and people would do that with impunity. Hate crimes in Sweden has gone up since 2008 to today. It has gone up over 40% against black people, Afrophobic hate crimes. And this is not, when we talk about hate crimes, I'm not even speaking of people calling you the N-word. I'm talking about you being in the streets and an unknown assailant would attack you and brutalize you, and to the extent of almost killing you. And this happens on a day-to-day basis. This happens to black people everywhere around Europe. And I mentioned political participation because that is a fundamental issue when in every democratic society. People should have the possibility in order to be able to influence their living conditions. Normally today we think we are a post-racial society because you have, if you go to France, you have a minister that's a black person. If you go to Sweden, you have a minister that's a black person. I normally say in the United States, you have Obama as the president, they kill 1,000 black men every year.
I agree with what the former speaker said. And I think one of the main problems in Europe specifically is that what you see in a lot of European countries is that there's a very strong self-image of innocence. The idea that, especially after the Second World War, that we moved beyond race. There are certain countries where there are literal policies where they say that race is not an issue. Instead of race, we talk about ethnicity or other euphemisms to make this specific problem extra invisible. And what the consequence of this is that there's a lack of awareness. We have people in office, people in general in European society who do not understand how this history of colonialism, slavery is related to present day problems of Afrophobia and racism affecting people of African descent. And we even have people in the highest level of office who have this self-image of being liberal, being tolerant, being open, whilst reproducing these structures of power and privilege.
We've talked a lot about structural racism today, and it's also mentioned quite significantly in the report as something that is facing people of African descent and black Europeans. I have two questions for you. Firstly, what can we do to combat the structural racism? And the second question is, what can we do as part of the ENAR network to spur decision makers on to act?
So I think this report clearly shows there's a big problem when we talk about Afrophobia and racism affecting people of African descent. One of the problems has been that it was invisible, that there was a lack of information, a lack of awareness about this issue. I think with this report we can help to raise awareness on all levels, from the grassroots to the national level to the European level. So I think we can use this report and use this information in a constructive way by making people aware and then start to make very concise problems targeting these specific issues affecting people of African descent. Those issues, those policy measures can include the decolonization of educational systems. It can include targets, diversity policies specifically aimed at people of African descent, but also other people of color on the labor market. It can include policies to fight ethnic profiling and so on and so on. So I think that everybody should, read this information and share it with their particular representatives on the national and international level.
I think I would like just to go back a few minutes on the report because I think we can use as a working group the report as a means to reivindicate the recognition of people of African descent using the term Afrophobia. Recognition is the first term of the decade, and if we don't get recognition of all African descent and African everywhere in the world, we never get justice and development. The first step is to get this recognition. That's why we really need to see this international decade applied, respect, and put in place by every government as it was decided at the UN level. Until now, it's not done. That's why the help, or I don't know, the pressure of the civil society, NGOs, network is very important. We have to change the balance of power where not implementing the decade, it's the same thing when you decide to not define exactly the racism faced by people of African descent. You ignore the process of the decade, you ignore what you have decided, as you ignore the kind of racism. And it is this decade will be the process where the victim of Afrophobia could become actor of social change, to pass from the status of victim to actor of social change.
We have to have an honest discussion and not try to put everything on the rug and pretend as if it doesn't exist. And this is what this report is really manifesting. It's showing the realities of black people all around Europe, a reality that policymakers earlier on do not want to manifest, they don't want to show, because that's why we don't have disaggregated data in a lot of countries. Now we're asking for disaggregated data. That's one of the fundamental issues that needs to be in place for us to be able to tackle the problems that black people are facing. For you to be able to legislate and find policies, put policies in place to remedy some of the situations that black people are facing, you need to know what the problems are. And without having the data disaggregated based on race, or at least if you want to call it construction of race, then you would not be able to identify where the problem areas are. Now, ENAR has taken a huge responsibility and say, you know what, we are going to collect data for you. We're going to make sure we write a report on each and every of these European countries, so you'll be able to have an idea as to what the realities of black people are today in Europe. And this is what the report manifests. And hopefully the policymakers would have a look at this report. They will read the outcome of this report. But not only that, they would also read recommendations. So we have not only written a report, but we also have recommendations to solutions. So if you ask the question, what can we do, apart from what we've already done? As civil society, we're going to continue to mobilize people. We're going to continue to talk to the grassroots. We're going to continue to become the voice of the grassroots in Europe. Let's use social media to make sure that we promote and distribute all this information and the content and the outcomes of this report. We have a hashtag which is Stop Afrophobia. We also have another hashtag which is Black in Europe. So use that hashtag and make sure that the information is out there to the world so people will know how it feels to be black in Europe.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for that amazing conversation and discussion about Afrophobia in Europe and what we can do to combat this phenomenon. And the report is now available online on the ENAR website, which is www.enar-eu.org, and you'll be able to download the report. You'll be able to read the other country briefings that we've produced, see other materials and videos that we put together to promote the information that we've got in this report.